So John and I are going to address whether or not the EU is a good thing, and I'm arguing that it's not. And the title of my presentation is The European Union, a Union in Name and Money Only. So the essential thesis of my presentation is that problems have plagued the EU since before it was even existed, and a lot of the same problems continue to plague it today, and I believe that they are insurmountable problems. So just to preview coming attractions, national differences, initial concerns haven't faded away. It's been doomed from the start. The monetary union has been a huge failure and has failed to deliver on even its weakest promises. Nationalism has been a barrier to reform perennially, and then I'll address some counter-arguments that I think the other side will have. Okay, so first off, the EU was doomed from the start. So, as you read in JUD today, the poor European countries were always kind of a concern for the wealthier European countries, so former West Germany, the kind of former Hanseatic leagues, the Nordic countries, etc., because they were concerned that these economically ailing countries were going to be a significant burden once obligation towards them was codified in a larger pan-national organization. So, as Jed says, what post-communist Europe really needed was a Marshall Plan, but no one was offering it. So essentially, the richer companies were unwilling, or at least their populations were unwilling, to subsidize economic revival in Eastern Europe. So the concern was, no one doubted that the EU could do wonders for Eastern Europe, but what might Eastern Europe do to the EU? So overall, this was kind of like a utilitarian argument that they should be included, right? The greatest good for the greatest number. This would overall uplift lots of people across the European Union, but at what cost to the countries who would be paying for it? Yes, and this is a concern that still exists today, especially when you look at the continuing economic squalor in Greece, which we'll talk about in just a second. So we have to talk about Brexit if we talk about the EU, because it's 2019. So Britain has kind of always been a little bit of a special situation because they've never been part of the monetary union. They've kept the pound. It's not pegged to the euro. And so they've kind of enjoyed a lot of the perks of being an EU member state, but they've maintained their own currency and therefore their own monetary policy, which we'll talk about next. But at the same time, the kind of changes there that have encouraged Brexit, like national sovereignty, and people are like, we don't want Europe ruling us, we want to rule ourselves, we're democratic, and the central power of the EU, takes away control from the people. And then the other point about this is that, even though at one point it may have been feasible for Britain to kind of get the privileges of being in the EU without monetary union, after Brexit, it probably can't expect to retain all of those privileges. Okay, so let's talk about monetary union. So this is kind of the central thesis of the majority of the articles we read today rested on the monetary union. So this is a map that shows the economic and monetary union of the EU. So if you look in blue, that's the Eurozone. So that's people who are all in. So political, monetary, these people use the euro, they're all in, they do the redistributive payments, they pay the VAT taxes, all that stuff. In yellow, Denmark is not a part of the Eurozone, it's like a kind of special situation. And then also the red ones are EU members without euro too, so this is kind of like the United Kingdom and some other places, which the United Kingdom doesn't use the euro. and then purple is Montenegro, which uses the euro but isn't in the eurozone. So basically, they just kind of like benefit from the monetary policy of the EU. And then I don't want to bog it down into the ERM too, but it's like this more recent policy change. It's kind of like the most recent, I guess, additions to.
Is it like the monetary policy without the euro? It'd be ERM.
I think so. I don't completely understand myself. When I looked at it, it was like very complicated. Anyway, so the essence of monetary union is, you know, if all of these places have the same currency, and we've talked about this a little bit before, if all these places have the same currency, they've got to have the same central bank. So like in the United States, we have the Federal Reserve that handles our monetary policy, i.e. printing money or not printing money. And the difference is in the EU, the European Central Bank, which handles all the printing of money, is not also a fiscal authority. So in America, like the Federal Reserve sets interest rates and has other financial manipulations that it can do to either stimulate or like hamper like the economy. So you may hear like in the news a lot like we're changing interest rates or whatever. So it's basically just other ways, you know, selling bonds, etc., that the government can, or the central bank rather, which is controlled by the government, can either encourage or discourage investment and economic growth. So that's kind of like the source of the problem in Europe, right? So they can control the money supply, but that's pretty much it. So the member nations of the EU pay in, you know, there are like all these taxes and stuff. The average person in Europe pays about 240 euros a year. So like the EU as a whole, those payments are kind of dispersed back into the countries. All the countries receive something. It's somewhat proportional. There are limits on how redistributive it is. But all of these things kind of go towards like big capital projects, usually like infrastructure. So in that way, the EMU has the capability to aid ailing countries, but as the Greek crisis shows, to a limited extent. So the Greek crisis. So this is a fun cartoon. But so everybody remembers, you know, like the 2008-9 financial crisis in the United States. It kind of got the ball rolling, but there are also other causes of the Greek financial crisis. Essentially what happened is they were financing tons and tons of debt, like 300 billion euros worth of debt with foreign investment. So like basically they were selling their debt to outside investors because, you know, they were an EU state. People think, you know, we'll get the money back eventually. But as the financial crisis hit, people lost faith, and all of a sudden they weren't able to sell their debt. And since they're part of the monetary union, they can't just print money to stimulate the economy. And since there's freedom of movement within the EU, lots of people just left because there were no jobs, and there was no like clear path to recovery. So that's the problem in Greece. And even they were first, just to like show you kind of like the extent of the crisis there, they were the first country to ever be late on loan repayment to the International Monetary Fund, which is like kind of a big deal. The International Monetary Fund is like this super international thing. We talked about Bretton Woods. Yeah, so kind of getting back to what I was referencing with Britain, a lot of people, you know, we've talked about this a lot. In Europe, a lot of people view themselves as, you know, Italian or German or Greek or Polish or whatever before they see themselves as European. And that's kind of the root cause of a lot of grievances over the EU's unity and monetary union, because, you know, ultimately, even though there is kind of like this centralized EU government, it's controlled by the member countries, which are controlled by, elections and democratic means. So as Eichen Green talks about in his article, the new Hanseatic League, which is kind of like all these Nordic countries that are in blue, and Germany, which are kind of like usually seen as like the richer countries in Europe, are hesitant to like subsidize other nations. And so here you have a quote from him: absent a willingness to contemplate political union, banking union and fiscal union are not possible. And without them, monetary union by itself will not stand. So this is getting back to the same issue I was just talking about. So monetary union, which is kind of all they have right now, is not enough on its own. They also need to have fiscal union to enact like meaningful enough policies to help ailing nations. But the problem is the people in Germany are like, no, I don't want to pay for Greek people's debt or whatever. So there's no political unity because people see themselves as members of one nation before others. So this is kind of what this is getting at. So Emmanuel Macron has said that if they kind of move towards a centralized taxing and spending model, which they already have to a limited extent with the value-added tax, which is like it's kind of like sales tax, that'll solve the problems because then, it's not just one country dealing with its own financial problems. It's kind of like everybody pays in, everybody gets it. But Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, is like, German people don't want to pay for that because they know that, them seeing any benefits of that are unlikely. And so Elliot also argues political unity is necessary because there's kind of like the extent of unity is not there yet. So yeah, this is kind of the problem, is that because of this lack of unity, the solutions that the European Central Bank and other entities within the European Union are kind of band-aids on a much larger wound. And the net effect of those is that there's a very stagnant economy. Like one of the articles said, like 0.2% growth over year, which is like infinitesimal. As Elliot addresses, this has like real serious effects because these kind of discourage investment as other opportunities for investment are rapidly arising in places like China. So Italy is, another, just like Greece, is very desperate economically, and so they're looking into investing in the Silk Road proposal of China because they're kind of not getting what they need from Europe, even though theoretically they should stand to benefit a ton from European Union. Okay, so just to look at the other side for a little bit, a lot of people are like, well, the euro may not be the best, but if we get rid of it, it'll be even worse. Some people point to Brexit as evidence of that, but the problem with that is that, the only other way to solve the problem is more political union, which, as I've shown, is just politically a non-starter. One of the authors' argued that Europe just needs more time. He was the only one that really kind of like supported the long-term success of the EU. But it seems like, these political trends of nationalism and economic stagnation seem like consensus is less likely as time goes on. So some people could say that Brexit shows that economic union is necessary for stability, but I believe that it's just kind of like evident that nationalism is more important than economic pragmatism in public opinion. So people, see a problem with being a part of the EU, they see it as an oppressor. So even though it's really helping them economically, they don't vote that way. And then finally, the autonomy and monetary policy would only lead to short-sighted solutions. So some people say that the Greek financial crisis wouldn't have been helped by being able to print more money or whatever. But I would argue the opposite point, which Jet and Techa, one of our articles, argue that monetary union was never necessary and it's certainly not like an integral part of what Europe is and the power of the EU. Okay, so in conclusion, the European Central Bank is unable to provide for the political and economic needs of member nations. So basically, it just doesn't have the right kinds of powers it needs to help countries meaningfully. The euro will undoubtedly remain, but at the risk of another financial crisis. But as I can read notes, maybe that crisis is what people need to kickstart reform and establish more political unity. And finally, in the foreseeable future at least, political unity is too unlikely to guarantee the EU's endurance.